Hi, this is Biological Anthropology, Anthropology 225. As biological anthropology is grounded in evolutionary theory, it's necessary to talk about evolution before we really begin talking more clearly about biological anthropology. So the title of today's lecture is Evolution. Evolution is defined as change over time. The idea of change over time was only recently incorporated into modern-day scientific thinking. Prior to the 19th century, the prevailing idea in Western thought was that nature did not change. For example, according to Ptolemy, an ancient Greek-Egyptian mathematician from the 2nd century AD, he believed that the Earth was placed at the center of the universe and that there were these spheres that revolved around the Earth. These spheres were things like the sun, the moon, as well as other planetary systems. He believed that the organic world was static and unchanging. Part of the reason that Ptolemy had the perspective that he did was based because he was very religious. Religion was very pervasive during this time period. Theology, in fact, was a very powerful spiritual, legal, and political force. The church set specific doctrine that could be opposed by the public, by scientists, by politicians, only under penalty of imprisonment or fiery deaths or a variety of other types of penalties. Part of the doctrine relayed by the church was that the natural world had always existed in the same form that it exists today. The natural world did not change. One such scientist who followed church doctrine was a man by the name of Aristotle. Aristotle developed what is known as the Great Chain of Being, as illustrated in this figure in the slide. The idea of the Great Chain of Being is that all organisms exist in a hierarchical ladder, and people are at the top rung, and this is part of natural philosophy and a part of the legal code. Given these constraints, it's very easy to understand why science barely progressed during this time period and why most scientists believed that the natural world was static and unchanging. During the 14th through the 18th centuries, a number of scientists and scholars began to question whether the world was as static as it was traditionally perceived to be. One of the best known scholars from this time period who did in fact challenge this idea was a man by the name of Nicholas Copernicus. This is from the 16th century. He was a cleric and an astronomer, and he is best known for having written a treatise on Ptolemy's ancient system. In this treatise, he argued that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but rather the sun is the center of the universe, and that the Earth revolves around the sun just as the other planets do. Copernicus's model of planetary system is referred to as heliocentric, which is centered around the sun, and contrasts with Ptolemy's ancient system, which is geocentric, centered around the Earth. Copernicus was not the only scientist from this time period. There were also a variety of other scientists whose contributions were also just as important and just as influential. Francis Bacon, he's primarily known for developing the hypothetico-deductive method and said that all scientists need to be using this method. He also argued that we all need to do experiments and have careful, detailed observations. I want you to recall that if you ever take any type of science class, you're going to be using the hypothetico-deductive method, which is from the 17th century and was developed by Bacon. René Descartes, best known for the development of Cartesian geometry. This is where you have your x and y axes. It's a new method of mathematics. Isaac Newton is probably the best known of these scholars from the 17th century. I would argue he's the greatest of the 17th century thinkers. His achievements include the development of modern-day calculus. Yes, he's a man that some people love, but the majority of us hate. He developed calculus. He also developed the application of mathematics to physics and astronomy, basically calculus, the formulation of the 3 laws of motion, the theory of light and color, the law of universal gravity. All of these ideas can be laid at Newton's feet. So he was a very, very avid scientist, really trying to understand how the natural world is structured. Probably a lesser known scientist from this time period, but just as important, was a man by the name of Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke is a geologist who was investigating the history of the Earth, much like most geologists do. In 1668, he was the first person to suggest that fossils are actually the remains of real plants and animals that were once alive. This conclusion was contrary to the majority of the opinions, which was that fossils were nothing more than quirks of nature. They were stone images. And I want to also point out that this was in fact heresy. It went completely against church doctrine. Hooke noted that many marine fossils were located far away from any ocean, and in order to explain this, he came up with the radical conclusion that the face of the earth had changed dramatically since its creation. Imagine if you were to find that there were fish and water birds in the Sahara Desert, underneath the sand. This is the type of situation that Robert Hooke was encountering. So as you can tell, the 17th century was marked by a tremendous number of exceptional scholars who had exceptional insights. The significance of these scholars' contributions lay in demonstrating that the structure of the universe is comprehensible to mere mortals. It's comprehensive to you and I. They recognized that there was a fundamental order in the universe, and it was our job as scientists to understand that order. Despite all the work that was being conducted in this 17th century, the notion of the fixity of species held strong by these scientists as well as the public. None of them had challenged the fixity of the species. Why? Because it was very common, the idea that God created each species as is. Anyone who challenged the perfection of God's designs was considered heretic and could be punished by a fiery death. This is what is known as an argument from design. Anybody who questioned the assumptions of fixity could be accused of challenging God's perfection, and this was a crime punishable, as I said, by fiery death. The plan of the entire universe was God's plan, God's design, and all anatomical structures were engineered by God to meet the purposes for which they were required. During the 18th century, we have 3 additional scientists whose contributions were tremendous. I'm going to go through each of them. Carolus Linnaeus, best known for writing Systema Naturae, a static classification of plants and animals, and binomial nomenclature. Louis Buffon, his main contribution was that there is variation within species. And Jean-Baptiste Lamarck created the first theory of macroevolution, and just as importantly, coined the term biology. So what can I tell you about these gentlemen? Linnaeus. Linnaeus is best known for his belief in the fixity of species, but he is also known for developing this classification system for plants and animals that he published in a book known as Systema Naturae. He classified organisms according to common traits. Organisms that were more similar had more common traits, were grouped together. Organisms that were less similar had less common traits, were grouped apart. For example, in plants he used similarities in the types of flowers they had. In insects he used similarities and differences in the types of wings. In fish he used similarities and differences in the types of scales that they had. In order to do this, in the creation of this system, Linnaeus assigned 2 Latin names to each organism. For example, in human beings, we have the genus name Homo and the species name Sapiens. The first name is termed the genus name. The second name is the specific or the trivial name, commonly called the species. These two names are internationally recognized for each particular form, and I want to make it very clear, even though this was created during the 18th century, this system is still widely used today. So humans are in the kingdom Animalia because we're animals. We're in the phylum Chordata because we have a backbone. We are in the class Mammalia because we have mammary glands. We are in the order Primates because we have an opposable thumb, and so on and so forth. Okay. It's important to note that although Linnaeus, or because Linnaeus, believed in the fixity of species, he did not ask some very important questions. He did not ask, why are some organisms so similar to others? Why are house cats, tigers, and lions so similar to one another? Why are monkeys, apes, and humans so similar to one another? He did not see that similar species were similar to one another because they share a common ancestry. Now, although this is true, not all the scientists from the 18th century believed that all these similarities were due to creation like Linnaeus did. For example, Count Louis Buffon. His primary contribution was recognizing that members of different species differed in many different ways. If you were to look around a mall or any busy shopping area and you look at all the people there, we're all one species, and yet we all vary in tremendous numbers of ways in height, hair color, eye color, body build. We all differ in many different ways. Members of a species differ in many different ways. He believed that different species could develop from a common ancestor that divided into two or more groups through migration to different areas, and each of those two groups would be influenced by local climatic conditions. So if one group went to a warm area and one group went to a cold area, these two groups would each adapt to the different types of climate in those different regions. Now, although he did not believe in the fixity of species, Buffon did and was thinking in evolutionary terms. Buffon never codified his belief into a comprehensive system. That is, he never developed a mechanism by which transition from one species into another could actually occur. The first person to do this was the man commonly known as Lamarck. Lamarck proposed the first theory of macroevolution. This is the actual transformation from one species into another. The theory of speciation. He proposed a mechanism, a plan, regarding how transformation from one species into another could actually occur. In particular, Lamarck argued that the degree of development of an organ, of any trait, of any character, is determined by how useful that organ or character is. Organs that are very useful are ones that are going to become stronger. Those that are of little use become weaker. He argued that the effects of use and disuse are passed on to subsequent generations, so they're passed on to their offspring, and this is commonly called the inheritance of acquired characteristics, and it is also known as Lamarckian inheritance. Lamarck argued that as environments change, the degree of usefulness changes. As environments change, new organisms develop and come into being. One of the interesting things about Lamarck's theory of macroevolution is that he believed wishes, desires, wills, and needs were all sufficient to motivate change. That is, if you wished something or you desired something or you needed something, it would be sufficient to motivate change. So these giraffes here, the more they use their long necks to get to the leaves at the top of the trees, the more energy is going to be put into their necks, and their necks are slowly going to grow longer and longer, and that's going to get passed on from one generation to the next. Okay. There are two primary problems with Lamarckian inheritance. The first, desires, wishes, and needs do not result in the ability to change morphology and behavior. And two, the inheritance of acquired traits is not possible. For example, just because my daughter dyed her hair blue, this is not my daughter, I'd kill her, just teasing, I wouldn't, does not mean that her offspring are going to have blue hair. If I were to dye my hair blonde, my children will not inherit my blonde hair. If I were, God forbid, to lose my arm in a car accident, my children that I would then have would not be born without one arm. Traits I acquire in my lifetime cannot be passed on to subsequent generations. Similarly, if I were to get breast implants, I would not be passing on bigger breasts to my children. Traits that you acquire during your lifetime you're not able to pass on to subsequent generations. Something I want to briefly mention is that just because Lamarck's explanation of species change is not genetically correct, it's frequently dismissed. But in fact, Lamarck deserves a lot of credit because he emphasized the importance of interactions between organisms and their environments in the evolutionary process. He also was the first to develop a mechanism by which evolutionary change from one species into another could actually occur. So he deserves a lot of credit. In addition, Lamarck, interestingly, is the first person to develop the term biology for the study of living organisms. And a central component of the study of biology is the idea of species change. So that's just an interesting aside. An opponent of Lamarck was a man. An opponent of Lamarck was a man by the name of Georges Cuvier. Okay, and these are actually three contributors from the 19th century: Georges Cuvier, Charles Lyell, and Charles Darwin. Cuvier, father of zoology, paleontology, and comparative anatomy. He developed the theory of catastrophism and was very opposed to the idea of evolution. Charles Lyell, he's the father of modern-day geology, developed the principle of uniformitarianism, and Charles Darwin developed the theory of natural selection. So what can I tell you about these three gentlemen? Cuvier. Cuvier was an opponent and a contemporary of Lamarck. He opposed the idea of evolution. He believed very, very strongly in the fixity of species. And he was interestingly, he was a leading scientist of his time. And as a result, he was the father of zoology, paleontology, and comparative anatomy. So he had seen a lot of variation in anatomy. And Cuvier, as a scientist, but as a religious man who did believe in the fixity of species, wanted to explain the extinction rate that he was seeing of all these organisms that were out there, as well as the increasing number of fossils being found all over the world and wondrous creatures not found on Earth today. So there are all these fossils and all these extinctions of organisms, and he wanted to try and explain it from a scientific perspective. Cuvier and his supporters sought to explain the concept of fossils by embracing the concept of extinction and embracing the concept of change. But they did it with a biblical twist. This is commonly known as the concept of catastrophism. According to Cuvier's catastrophism, floods, earthquakes, and other natural disasters are responsible for ending major geological sequences. So you have all these natural disasters, these acts of God, they end geological sequences, and they killed all the animals at those times. What then happened is that new animals were created, or the area was restored, or animals came to that area from neighboring areas. New animals were either created or the area was restored from neighboring areas not destroyed by natural disasters. Since Cuvier needed to be consistent with emerging fossil evidence, which indicated that organisms had become more complex over time, Cuvier proposed that after each disaster, The incoming migrants had a more modern appearance, because they were the result of a more recent creation event. The last creation event was Noah's flood. Charles Lyell is best known today as the father of modern-day geology. He wrote a 3-volume book entitled The Principles of Geology, and in it he argued that geological processes observed in the present are the same as those which occur in the past. These processes, such as wind and rain and earthquake, in the past produced the geological landscape that is present today. Mountains, lakes, rivers. These were all created by slow-working processes such as wind and rain and earthquakes. This theory, which has become to be known as the principle of uniformitarianism. Charles Lyell suggested that in order for such slow-acting forces to produce momentous change, the Earth must be much older than previously suspected. By providing an immense time scale and altering the Earth's history from a few thousand years to millions of years, Lyell changed the framework within which scientists view the geological past. Archbishop Usher was the person prior to Lyell who had estimated the age of the Earth. Prior to Lyell stating the Earth was older than previously thought, it was thought that the Earth was only a mere 4004 BC. This age was calculated by James Usher, who calculated the age of the Earth using the Old Testament. He counted backwards using the ages of the main characters in the Old Testament, and using an average generation length, Usher arrived at the age of 4004. So basically, what Lyell did is it gave plenty of time for evolution to occur if the Earth was really now millions of years old instead of a mere 4,000 years old. Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, interestingly, graduated from Christ College in Cambridge. One of the most surprising things that students learn about Charles Darwin is that he was not majoring in natural science, but rather he had majored in theology, and he had planned to be a priest like younger sons from this time period generally became. He was very interested, though, in his studies of theology in natural sciences, and he was recommended as a naturalist for the HMS Beagle, which was a 5-year scientific expedition around the world. Darwin was given this position, and while on board the HMS Beagle, he collected, dissected, and organized these specimens. During this trip, he began to doubt the fixity of species based on his observations, and it was in 1832 he wrote, "A snake with rudimentary hind limbs mark the passage by which nature joins lizards to other snakes." Now, Darwin, of course, is best known for visiting the Galapagos. The Galapagos is located off the west coast of South America, off of Ecuador, and it became a crucial point in his thinking on evolution. He noted that the fauna and flora of South America were similar, as if they were related to those on the Galapagos, yet they were different enough to be considered different. More surprisingly, the animals of each of the various islands in the Galapagos differed slightly from one another. He observed 13 different types of finches throughout the small islands. A different species of finch was observed on each island. Each of the birds differed in the structure of their beaks, their body form, as well as their plumage, that is, their feather colors. And each species seemed to be specifically adapted to the different habitats on each of the different islands within the Galapagos. Darwin also noted a very important part. The islands of the Galapagos were volcanic, and they were not very old. So how could these differences have developed in such a short period of time? Once again, These observations from the Galapagos caused Darwin to wonder about the fixity of species. Darwin concluded from these observations that when groups are geologically separated, the separate groups develop gradually into separate species, and this is commonly referred to as evolution by common descent. Evolution by common descent. During his trip, Darwin had been thinking about what we now call artificial selection, that is, the selective breeding of animals to produce traits that we find useful. For example, selectively breeding cows that produce lots of milk, and eventually you're going to have a whole herd of cows that produce lots of milk. Remember, it only took 10,000 years to change a wolf into a Shih Tzu or a poodle. Take a majestic animal like a wolf and turn it into a little lapdog. A mere 10,000 years. So artificial selection can work relatively rapidly. Darwin understood that artificial selection was a key to the evolution of species. But prior to his trip, he really didn't understand how it worked in nature. And while Darwin was on board the ship, the HMS Beagle, Darwin had a lot of time on his hands, as you can imagine, and he was reading a lot. One of the books that Darwin read during this time period was a book by Thomas Robert Malthus, and the book is titled On the Principles of Population. Darwin obtained two very important points from this book. The first is that human populations, if they grow unrestrained, grow exponentially. For example, human populations can double every 25 years. Second, food resources increase arithmetically, not exponentially, but arithmetically. This means 1 + 1 + 1 instead of 2 squared, okay? Essentially, food resources increase much slower than populations grow. Malthus, in his book, and Darwin noted this point, that because of the infinite growth potential of human populations and the finite growth of food populations, the growth of human populations is checked by a struggle for existence. Population growth is checked by a struggle for existence. This simple concept, the struggle for existence, provided Darwin with a mechanism for how evolution occurred. Darwin realized that this principle, the struggle for existence, applies to all organisms. Individuals with favorable characteristics for living in an environment are the ones that are going to survive to reproduce. Those with unfavorable variations would not and would be therefore eliminated. Darwin realized during this time that it was the individual and not the type that was important. Okay? Darwin did not originate the idea of evolution. Okay? Darwin was a synthesizer. Ancient Greeks and Lamarck wrote numerous papers supporting the idea of evolution, nor were the ideas used by Darwin in his theory of natural selection all his own invention. The struggle for existence, that was from Malthus. Variation, that came from Buffon. Adaptation, that was Lamarck. All of these ideas had been discussed for many, many years. Darwin's contribution, once again, was as a synthesizer. He brought together all of these divergent ideas and added together the key concept of natural selection. Darwin, I want to point out, was not the only person to come up with the theory of natural selection. Alfred Russel Wallace did too, independently, but he was working in Malaysia. Wallace wrote to Darwin, and together they did present their work to the Linnaean Society. So what is Darwin's theory of natural selection? First is all organisms are capable of producing offspring faster than the food supply increases. Recall, that's from Malthus. Second, all things show variation. That came from Buffon. 3. Because populations grow faster than the food supply, there are more individuals than can survive. Consequently, there is a fierce struggle for existence. Those with more favorable characteristics in size and strength will have a better chance to survive and reproduce. 4th, variations or traits will be passed on to offspring. If these traits were not inherited, then animals who have adaptive traits that allow them to better survive could not pass those benefits on to their offspring. 5th, small changes over every generation lead to major changes over long periods of time. A classic example are the peppered moths. Peppered moths live in early 19th century England. Historically, they were this light gray color. There was an adaptation in their environment because it made them invisible on the trees in which they rested. Light color moths were much less likely to be eaten by birds. Occasionally, we would find a black moth in the population through mutation, but these black moths were rapidly eaten by the birds because they were highly visible on these light colored trees. So here's the white one and here's the black one. Then changes occurred in the environments of the moths. With the Industrial Revolution, soot from all the factories began to cover the bark of the trees. See this? All this black stuff? This is soot. This dramatically changed the fitness values of the different wing colors. Black moths were now well camouflaged, and white moths were not camouflaged. As a result, these gray moths were now being seen and being eaten by the birds, while the black moths were camouflaged. So the white ones now didn't survive in high frequencies, but the black ones lived to reproduce. This is the struggle for existence. The black ones lived to reproduce more black moths, and that's the inheritance of favorable traits. In a few decades, almost all the moths were blacks. This is natural selection producing evolution.